Chapter 2. It's later than we thought. Observed climate change is faster than expected. One occurring theme in environmentalism is that the apocalypse is always imminent, but forever deferred. Every generation seems to have one last chance to save the planet. Biologist Barry Commoner said back in 1970, "We are in a period of grace, we have time. Perhaps a generation in which to save the environment from the final effects of the violence we have already done to it." Quoted in Christopher Main's Green Rage, Radical Environmentalism, and Unmaking of Civilization. Similar pronouncements can be heard today, but the period of grace is probably over. Back in 1990, the editors of The Ecologist set out a general evaluation of the state of the Earth in 5,000 days to save the planet. Today, we are told that our planet is in crisis, that we are destroying and polluting our way to a global catastrophe. We may have as little as 15 years, perhaps as short a time as 5,000 days, to save the planet. One of the major concerns arising out of the Gaia theory is that we are pushing natural processes beyond their capacity to maintain an atmosphere fit for higher forms of life. Beyond a certain point, the system may flip to an entirely new state, which would be extremely uncomfortable for life as we know it. Once triggered, the change to the new state could occur with extreme rapidity. Edward Goldsmith et al., 5,000 Days to Save the Planet. By 2005, the countdown envisaged in the title had reached zero, and the originator of the Gaia theory, James Lovelock, was writing The Revenge of Gaia, where he would state that the thought of living Earth was probably now moving irrevocably to a hot state. Lovelock came to this conclusion primarily as a result of seeing scientific observations of climate change surpassing what most predictions said was meant to be happening. In an address to the Royal Society, he stated, "The positive feedback on heating from the melting of floating Arctic and Antarctic ice alone is causing an acceleration of system-driven heating, whose total will soon or already be greater than that from all of the pollution CO2 that we have so far added. This suggests that implementing Kyoto, or some super Kyoto, is most unlikely to succeed. We have to understand that the Earth system is now in positive feedback and is moving ineluctably towards the stable hot state of past climates." James Lovelock, Climate Change on the Living Earth, lecture at the Royal Society. Lovelock's public advocacy of nuclear power, disbelief in wind farms as a panacea, and his clear statements that massive climate change is now probably inevitable has made him unpopular with many Greens. His pro-nuclear stance is practical if you are pro-civilization like he is. He does not say that nuclear power is the solution to global heating, which he sees as now inevitable. He thinks nuclear fission and eventually nuclear fusion are the only technologies capable of keeping the lights on as civilization retreats. As someone who wants the lights to go out, I can see the logic of his arguments, but wanting the opposite have no need to agree with his stance or reject his wider arguments because of it. He's definitely off message. It's rather inconvenient, then, that he's got such a good environmental and scientific pedigree. As a polymath in his 90s, he has worked in many fields. Notably, he invented the electron capture detector that made the discovery of the ozone hole and the writing of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring possible. Arguably the book that launched the environmental, rather than conservation, movement. His initially heretical Gaia hypothesis of a self-managing living Earth is now widely accepted under the title Earth System Science. He's long argued for wild land expansion and been sympathetic to ecological defense actions. As an avid hiker, he even carried out a personal bombing campaign around the right to roam way back in the 1930s. His detractors often admire his pioneering work, but say, in a somewhat ageist manner, that he is now gone a bit batty. The real problem, though, is that he has made a professional career of being beholden to no one else's ideology or pay packet. As such, he has the capacity to say what many in scientific and environmental institutions are thinking, but are afraid to say so directly in public. Lovelock thinks that a range of factors have led to a consistent underdiagnosis of the extent of human effects on the Earth. These factors include a speed and complexity of change which research and publication schedules cannot keep up with, a failure to see and comprehend the living Earth as a dynamic, self-regulating system, a lack of joined-up thinking due to academic compartmentalization, governmental pressures on the writing of IPCC synthesis reports. Here it is less the science itself which is at question, but its presentation in the policy-making summary, the editing and wording of which does come under some level of governmental pressure. Others in the field have also called for increased independence from government. the possibly considerable masking of present heating by global dimming. Industrial pollution has increased aerosol particles in the atmosphere, which are thought to reflect sunlight back into space and seed clouds. If one could somehow turn off global industry tomorrow, this dimming effect would disappear and surface temperatures could rise significantly, almost immediately. This could push feedback mechanisms into place, with massive increases in greenhouse gases being emitted by non-human managed systems. Lovelock says for this reason he thinks we are living in a fool's climate, damned if we do and damned if we don't. Here I have outlined a very simple, and therefore flawed, picture of a very complex process. For a better stating of the theory, see Meinrad and Ray et al. A strong present-day aerosol cooling implies a hot future, in Nature, 30th of June 2005. For a more approachable, if simplistic and partially out of date, intro to global dimming, watch BBC's 2005 Global Dimming documentary. The masking effect is now widely accepted, but its extent is still unknown. For instance, in the 2008 study by the Met Office Hadley Center, models show either a modest or severe increase in heating following a sudden removal of haze. Either way, it is very likely that present-day aerosol cooling is suppressing a major portion of current greenhouse warming. Peter Stott, et al. Observed climate change constrains the likelihood of extreme future global warming. In Tellus B, 60. Among the advocates of purposeful geoengineering, the idea of increasing global dimming by dumping sulfates into the stratosphere seems to be gaining support. Oh joy! It's worth underlining that by the time you read this, much of the science will have been superseded or advanced. It's beyond the scope of this text to give an overall summation of all of Lovelock's thinking, never mind the wider science around global heating. Part of the nature of the problem is that by the time you read this, the science will have moved on considerably. If you are interested in having a look at the sources I have referenced and read wider yourself. However, while the details may vary, the inexorable direction of much of the science seems to be that we are probably heading to a considerably hotter Earth, and fast. Recent observations put us further down the road than many of us thought even a few years ago. Decades later, down the road. Combined with inertia around reducing carbon emissions, this makes the chances of stopping massive climate change probably rather slight. While NGOs are still babbling about stopping at 2 degrees warming, increasingly many climate scientists are discussing a 4-year degree warming by end of the century, or even as early as 2060. Proceedings of the September 2009 conference, 4 degrees and beyond, implications of a global change of 4+ degrees for people, ecosystems, and Earth system. Jointly sponsored by the University of Oxford, the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research, and the Met Office Hadley Centre. This is by no means a fringe worry. The 2007 IPCC report predicted a rise between 2 and 6.4 degrees Celsius this century. Bob Watson, the former chairman, has warned that the world should work on mitigation and adaptation strategies to prepare for 4 degrees Celsius of warming. Bob Watson quoted in How to Survive the Coming Century. This is bad enough, but Lovelock goes further and cites a number of feedback mechanisms he thinks are already moving us to an even hotter state, of which the melting of sea ice mentioned above is the most well known. What could this new hot state look like? Some highlights. Hot deserts spreading over much of the global south and into southern and even some of central Europe. Cold deserts predominantly in the global north retracting to leave new frontier land in Siberia, Scandinavia, Canada, Greenland, Alaska, and even to a certain extent in the Antarctic. Mass attempts at migration from arid zones to the still habitable areas, and mass human die-off coupled with accelerating species extinctions. Lovelock puts it rather bluntly. Humans are in a pretty difficult position, and I don't think they are clever enough to handle what's ahead. I think they'll survive as a species alright, but the cull during this century is going to be huge. The number remaining at the end of the century will probably be 1 billion or less. Quoted in How to Survive the Coming Century. Of course, I don't know this is a true picture of present and future climate change. The true complexity of the Earth system and many human social dynamics within it is probably beyond our comprehension and definitely beyond mine, and models should not be confused with reality. My informed hunch, that's all one has in the fool-making business of describing the future, is that the picture painted is probably a reasonable approximation. You may not think so, but I would ask that you run with me as it's a possibility worth considering. That hunch is as much informed by an anarchist critique of capitalism as it is a reading of climate science. Looking around me, it's a lovely bright day, and the leaves of the trees are almost shining. But little in the society in which I live indicates to me that a problem of the scale and complexity of climate change is going to get fixed. Given that, I feel that the big question posed is not so much if we will reach a world somewhat resembling that outlined above, but when. Lovelock is seriously proposing that such a world, or to be more accurate, such worlds, will emerge by the end of this century, and that emergence trends will start to become obvious by mid-century. It could take longer, but either way it may be advantageous to take such shifts into consideration when thinking about what we want to achieve in our lives. Here, to be clear, we are not talking about a millennial apocalypse, though it may feel like that to some chord in its more horrible or exciting moments. Rather, we are talking about massive accelerating change. James Hansen from NASA comments, "If we wish to preserve a planet similar to that in which civilization developed and to which life adapted, Paleolithic evidence and ongoing climate change suggest that CO2 will need to be reduced from its current 385 ppm to at most 350 ppm. James Hansen, quoted by Bill McKibben in Civilization's Last Chance. Chances are, it won't be. The environmental niche that civilization, class-divided, agriculturally sustained city culture, developed in is on the way out. With it will probably go many of civilization's citizens. And there are many, many citizens. Ghost acres feed population overshoots. Integral to the growth of industrial capitalism has been a vast increase in human population. There are now around 7 billion of us compared to around 600 million at the beginning of the 18th century. That jump has happened in 13 generations, and in large part it was no accident. In contrast, the prehistoric planetary hunter-gatherer population is estimated to have stayed under 10 million for nearly all of Homo sapiens' 60,000 generations. Silvia Federici has clearly laid out that a key foundation of early capitalism was the destruction of women's control over their own fertility. Wombs became public territory, controlled by men and the state, and procreation was directly placed at the service of capitalist accumulation. While it was capitalism that first enforced and then enabled this most recent mass expansion, in doing so it was, and is, singing an older anthem of civilization. This time, though, with mechanical amplification. Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the fowl of the air, and over every living thing that moveth upon the earth. King James Bible, Genesis 1:28. I was born in the mid-1970s when the human population was 4 billion. By the time I die, hopefully not before 2050, the UN estimates that the Earth's human population will be over 9 billion. World Population Prospects, the 2008 revision, Population Division of the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the United Nations Secretariat. This estimate, though, presumes business as usual. Whether this happens or not will depend on 3 interdependent factors: birth control, death control, and food supply. Worldwide, despite the continued edicts of cult patriarchs such as the Pope, many are increasingly using birth control to limit family size. The continuing power struggle to enable us to do so is a key battle, and one around which many anarchists, among others, have organized. The work of new social movement anarchists and feminists from the 60s onwards is relatively well known, but anarchist movement in birth control struggles reaches much further back. Emma Goldman, among many things a nurse and midwife, was one of the most well-known examples, and for lots of the movement's nameless, it was a significant part of their daily organizing. This is as much an issue of class struggle as of women's liberation. As Emma Goldman proclaimed, large families are a millstone around the necks of working people. The following quote refers to French anarchists of the early 20th century, but could apply to many in other countries. Anarchism can be considered their crowning synthesis, and Neo-Malthusianism, family planning, education, and anti-militarism were valid and necessary fields of activity for anarchists working for a total social revolution. David Berry, A History of the French Anarchist Movement. However, the spread of birth control and the fight for women's liberation, more generally, will not stop the probable doubling of human population in my lifetime. See George Bradford, Women's Freedom, in How Deep is Deep Ecology. With decreasing family size already a global norm in much of the world, it is the ability of industrial medicine and hygiene measures to enact death control that is now key. The human population, at least in business as usual projections, will continue to rise until at least 2050 as long as those alive today live their expected lifespans and have the expected number of children. However, we do not have to wait until then to overshoot the planet's human carrying capacity, its maximum permanently supported load, as we have probably done so already. Industrial civilization has managed to push up food supply by both colonizing ever more wild land for agriculture and developing fossil fuel-reliant green revolution agro-technologies and transportation. For a decent intro to issues around the green revolution, see Vandana Shiva, Monocultures of the Mind, Perspectives on Biodiversity, and Biotechnology. Essentially, industrial agriculture relies on the harvesting of ghost acreage, the fossilized photosynthetic production of ecosystems millions of years ago, to produce food at the present rate. William R. Catton Jr., Overshoot, the ecological basis of revolutionary change. This can be only temporary unless one is a believer in the cornucopian myth that resources are limitless. Someday the fossil fuel hunting will draw a blank. When this will happen, no one really knows, though many argue that we have already passed peak oil. Some may counter that hydrogen fuel cells, solar power, genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and green goo will somehow avert a population crash. These apostles of progress more and more resemble cargo cults in their belief that technology marshaled by either the market, if capitalist, or state planning, if socialist, will provide all that is needed. In the unlikely event that they're right, and the food supply does keep up with population growth, the highly managed nature of the provision will guarantee that the freedom supply, for both humans and other animals, is increasingly scarce. So the rapidly growing human population needs fossil fuels to stay alive. Most of us are eating oil, and illness is largely controlled with high-energy reliant technologies. Here is yet another reason I doubt the ability of activists, or states for that matter, to convince society to decarbonize. It sounds nice, but for millions, if not billions, it would mean shorter lives if humanity stopped importing from the past. On a significantly hotter globe, a major human die-off could be on the cards even if one does not go along with the ideas around peak oil. As much of the majority world becomes hotter and poorer, farmers will be unable to afford the petrochemical-based imports necessary for continued production, even if fossil fuels don't run out. Further, while industrial agriculture has temporarily increased land's carrying capacity, in the process much productive land has been denuded and without the application of fertilizers would now be unable to produce as much food organically as it did originally. Even southerners lucky enough to still have access to fossil fuel inputs will find magic potions lose their powers when soil dries, bakes, and blows away. With little nutrition or medicine, disease will harvest much of the hungry. It would be nice to imagine that those countries will still be able to produce considerable food quantities, in part thanks to improved growing conditions, more of that later, would gift it, but I wouldn't hold your breath. 1 billion people on Earth are already hungry. World hunger hits 1 billion, BBC. Rather than the spectacular mass death of whole communities, this mostly causes increased childhood mortality and decreased overall lifespan. Yet capitalism has, from the beginning, had definite form, just ask the Irish, in allowing and causing millions to starve more dramatically. Mike Davis reminds us of an often forgotten example when he writes, in late Victorian holocausts, of the 30 to 60 million people in the later part of the 19th century who starved to death, not outside the modern world system, but in the very process of being forcibly incorporated into its economic and political structures. Mike Davis, Late Victorian Holocausts, El Nino famines, and the making of the Third World. Similar hungers have taken their toll throughout the following century, many engineered by state socialists, those most attentive students of British Empire. It would be hopelessly utopian to believe that hunger could be exiled from the human condition, but mostly those dying today of starvation do so whilst others in their societies keep eating. Hunger is the language of class warfare. Power has many levels, and amongst much of the poorest, starvation in the future is likely to be played out as gendered violence, as it is now. This girl here, for instance, is in a feeding center in Ethiopia. The entire center was filled with girls like her. What's remarkable is that her brothers, in the same family, were totally fine. In India, in the first year of life, from 0 to 1, boy and girl babies basically survive at the same rate because they depend on the breast, and the breast shows no son preference. From 1 to 5, girls die at a 50% higher mortality rate than boys in all of India. Cheryl Woodan, our century's greatest injustice. I will leave it to others to argue about the relative contribution of population numbers or industrial consumption patterns, as though both are not now intrinsically linked, to global heating. Today, global and local population growth is a barrier to any significant decarbonization. Tomorrow, capitalism's present inability to out-engineer its addiction to fossil fuels will likely result in a massive population crash. Climate change brings possibilities as well as closures. Global heating, population growth, peak oil, and other environmental limits are probably not the apocalypse that will end the reign of capital and the state everywhere. The global collapse is probably no nearer than the global revolution. Nevertheless, it does mean that a totalized global capitalism, enclosing all relationships within it, becomes even less likely. The Western project of cultural expansion faces its limits. As part of that, the libertarian movements which capitalism has carried on its coattails also face the real limits to the growth of anarchism. Yet, just as the establishment of a one world of anarchism is foreclosed, so the possibilities of many new and old worlds, some anarchies, become widespread. Some of these possibilities will be opened up by conflict, some will be closed by conflict. The very nature of states is to control populations, but many of the billions will not hunger quietly. Yesterday, the late Victorian Holocaust triggered millenarian uprisings amongst those being swept away by the spreading floodwaters of the world system. Tomorrow, as the tide retracts and the surplus populations are left on the desert sand, we seem set for yet another, if anything more brutal, century of wars and insurrection. Chapter 3. Desert Storms. The military looks to the future. Whilst politicians of both states and social movements repeat platitudes, smile at their constituents, and face off against each other, some realists are looking to a climate-changed future less as something that can be avoided, and more as something that will need to be policed. In national security and the threat of climate change, leading thinkers and actors from the US military investigated a wide range of scenarios. Their first finding was that projected climate change poses a serious threat to America's national security. How? In already weakened states, extreme weather events, drought, flooding, sea level rise, retreating glaciers, and the rapid spread of life-threatening diseases will themselves have likely effects. Increased migration, further weakened and failed states, expanded ungoverned spaces, exacerbating underlying conditions that terrorists seek to exploit, and increased internal conflict. In developed countries, these conditions threaten to disrupt economic trade and introduce new security challenges, such as increased spread of infectious disease and increased immigration. CNA Corporation, National Security, and the Threat of Climate Change. As well as seeing climate change as a new and hostile stressing factor that will produce novel threats generally, they also saw it as exacerbating existing specific ones. Climate change acts as a threat multiplier for instability in some of the most volatile regions of the world. Many governments in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East are already on the edge in terms of their ability to provide basic needs: food, water, shelter, and stability. Projected climate change will exacerbate the problems in these regions and add to the problems of effective governance. Unlike most conventional security threats that involve a single entity acting in specific ways at different points in time, climate change has the potential to result in multiple chronic conditions, occurring globally within the same time frame. Economic and environmental conditions will further erode as food production declines, diseases increase, clean water becomes increasingly scarce, and populations migrate in search of resources. Weakened and failing governments with an already thin margin of survival foster the conditions for internal conflict, extremism, and movement towards increased authoritarian and radical ideology. Because climate change also has the potential to create natural and humanitarian disasters on a scale far beyond what we see today, Its consequences will likely foster political instability where social demands exceed the capacity of governments to cope. Similar nightmares and fantasies are talked about by military experts elsewhere. For example, with the effects of climate change compounding existing pressures, future operations will be more frequent and more intense than those currently underway in East Timor and the Solomon Islands. Air Chief Marshal Angus Houston said that rising sea levels caused by climate change would worsen social problems on the islands, many of which are poor and undeveloped, with the potential for sustained economic growth low in all but a few countries. This meant that island nations would struggle to adapt to climate change, he said, while changing rainfall patterns, extreme weather, and rising sea levels would threaten agriculture and fisheries on which they depended. From there, it is a small step to political instability and social order, Houston said. Australian military head warns of Pacific climate instability, France 24. It should be remembered that armies plan for what could possibly happen, not what will definitely happen. Additionally, there is institutional self-interest in thinking the world is getting more dangerous if your job is providing enforced order. However, it is worth taking their predictions of strife seriously, not least because when policy recommendations such as theirs are enacted, shadows of their dreams can become reality. Just as generals are always fighting the last war, so too their vision of future ones are shaped by present conflict. It should come as no surprise, then, that much of the military discourse around climate change is centered around hot wars, failed states, and political violence that can emanate from them. Potential cold wars within the global north and extreme south are given less prominence. I'll follow this convention for now, though I will return to such possibilities later. Hot wars and failed states. Looking at conflicts today, there is already an obvious equatorial tension belt which has expected to significantly expand. Its existence is due to the whole host of variables, not least of which are the accumulated environmental impacts from collapsed civilizations, the legacies of direct Western colonialism, high population levels, the presence of resources useful to capitalism and habitats that are on the margin of agricultural viability. James R. Lee, Climate Change and Armed Conflict, Hot and Cold Wars. Given what the US generals describe above, some governments in these regions will fall, whilst others, to varying degrees, will fail, quote, some states will retract back to their maybe shifting capitals, leaving the rest of their supposed territories in a mosaic of war and peace. Others will be engulfed in civil war, revolution, and interstate conflict. There will no doubt be much horror, but also much potential for constructing free lives. Unsurprisingly, there is division among military thinkers on what the great powers of today will be able to do. Some argue that they may be drawn more frequently into these situations, either alone or with allies, to help provide stability before conditions worsen and are exploited by extremists, and that they may also be called upon to undertake stability and reconstruction efforts once a conflict has begun to avert further disaster and reconstitute a stable environment. National security and the threat of climate change. Others predict a markedly reduced planetary policing role and an effective end to the New World Order declared by the US, which, lacking the means to help local authorities restore order, will likely fall back on a combination of policies that add up to quarantine. Kurt M. Campbell et al., The Age of Consequences, the Foreign Policy and National Security Implications of Global Climate Change. Social movement anarchists in these regions might want to think seriously about what practical preparations can wisely be made for self-rule, civil war, survival, and the unfortunately inevitable emergence and strengthening of authoritarian forces and inter-ethnic conflict. We must have the ability to defend ourselves, survive, and exploit crises in society, including capitalist attempts to destroy us. The divided and industrial nature of today's society has already determined the instability of tomorrow. Down with empire, up with spring. In the depths of crises with social demands, quote, exceeding the ability of government to cope, the glory days of anarchism may be back. If climate change results in reduced rainfall and access to the natural capital that sustains livelihood, poverty will become more widespread, leading to increased grievances and better recruitment opportunities for rebel movements. R. Nordas and N.P. Gleditch, Climate Change and Conflict, Political Geography. Who knows, we may even see scenes as dramatic as the anarchist armored trains of Maria Nikiforova. Maria Nikiforova was the only woman commander of a large revolutionary force in Ukraine, an atamancha. The free combat druzina was equipped with 2 large guns and an armored flat car. The wagons were loaded with armored cars, tachankas, and horses, as well as troops, which meant that the detachment was in no means restricted to railway lines. The trains were festooned with banners reading, "The liberation of the workers is the affair of the workers themselves. Long live anarchy. Power breeds parasites, and anarchy is the mother of order." With their black flags and cannons, Marussia's echelons resembled pirate ships sailing across the Ukrainian steppe. Malcolm Archibald, Atamancha, The Story of Maria Nikarova, the Anarchist Joan of Arc. From the steppes of the Ukraine to the Sierras of Mexico and the streets of Barcelona, a huge number of those who never identified as anarchists did so embroiled in overt war. Unfortunately, in most places, rebel movements are more likely to be statist than anarchist. This is partly thanks to the large number of established authoritarian political gangs compared to libertarian ones, but also because in extreme situations, people turn to extremist solutions. In some places, this might be self-organized, decentralized, and mutual aid, but in many there will be no social solution possible, just the false promises of despots and prophets. That's not to say we couldn't compete with them by spreading rival millennial hopes of a new dawn, but if we are honest with ourselves, having thrown aside religion, it would be a travesty of our ethics to pick it up again in the cause of gang recruitment and the joy of trouble. Where visible and dramatic libertarian social forces do arise, it is likely that many from other parts of the world will travel to join them. As the clouds darken, some of our family may run towards outbreaks of armed resistance, wherever they may be. This comes from a deep felt love and feelings of solidarity, but also because, let's be honest, for many, conflict is attractive, and anti-militarists rarely get the opportunity for outright war. The nihilistic desire, amplified in an increasingly complex world, to just get out there and fuck shit up, if not a creative urge, definitely a strong one. That's not to say everyone has it, but many do. Here there is an uncomfortable symmetry between our emotional drivers and that of fighters generally. In the ex-territory of failed and fallen states, inter-ethnic conflict will become ever more common, at least until populations are cut back to a level more fitting a much hotter world. The failed states have conflict levels so high and persistent that even baseline changes forecast by the IPCC are likely to worsen livelihood conditions. The trend suggests more of a social or tribal breakdown than wars between nations. Climate trends will ignore borders, and failed states prone to conflict will spread like a disease. James R. Lee, Climate Change and Armed Conflict, Hot and Cold Wars. Peacekeepers in the Graveyard of the Living. Such forces of interethnic conflict will be far more widespread than groups organized around European-originated political ideologies, libertarian or authoritarian. They are, after all, able to provide real solutions, if only temporarily, to people's immediate needs in areas where the basics for survival are outnumbered by thirsty mouths. This is done, of course, by wrenching resources from the others. Additionally, interethnic conflicts can erupt when the cause is hopeless but the emotional driver is strong. The consoling beliefs that individuals willingly join conflicts driven only by rational strategic considerations, family narratives, or historical burdens dissolves when brought into the light of the expressed desires of many fighters themselves. For a dramatic European example, one only needs to read Matthijs van der Poort's study of a community swept up in a civil war. In Gypsies, Wars, and Other Instances of the Wild, he presents voices of people who, in festive mood, took on the role of barbarians. How is this possible in Europe at the end of the 20th century? Was the question that played obsessively through my mind. What the war in former Yugoslavia forced us to digest is the fact that people proved willing to make a conscious and active choice to embrace regression, barbarity, or return to the wilderness. Take the Serb fighters who dream of a return to the Serbia of the epic poems, where there was no electricity, no computers, when the Serbs were happy and had no cities, the breeding grounds of all evil. Matthijs van der Poort, Gypsies, Wars, and Other Instances of the Wild, Civilization, and its Discontents in a Serbian Town. That some modern-day militias reflect romanticist desires whilst shelling towns, massacring villages, and being killed in turn, should neither surprise us nor necessarily fully invalidate romance. It does, however, suggest, along with the honest expressions of joy and destruction mouthed by some soldiers in every war, as well as many anarchists, that there is a coupling of some sort between a generalized urge to destroy and a disgust at complex human society. Randolph Bourne was right when he said war is the health of the state, but this other driver is at work too, especially where the sides are no longer states. Randolph Bourne, war is the health of the state. French anarchist anthropologist Pierre Clostray's description of war among Amazonian tribes is not directly transferable to interethnic conflicts involving non-anarchist peoples, but nevertheless, an echo does resonate. What is the function of primitive war? To assure the permanence of dispersal, of the parceling out, of the atomization of group. Primitive war is the work of a centrifugal logic, of a logic of separation, which expresses itself from time to time in armed conflict. War serves to maintain each community in its political independence. Now, what is the legal power that embraces all differences in order to suppress them, which only supports itself to abolish the logic of the multiple in order to substitute it for the opposite logic of unification? What is the other name of the one that refuses in essence primitive society? It is the state. Pierre Clostray's Archaeology of Violence. It is not all hubris and double talk when military spin doctors describe statist invasions as peacekeeping. Ethnic diversity and autonomy often emerge both from mutual aid in community and animosity between communities. I like to think, and our history books back this up, that self-identified anarchists will never inflict such pain as the Serb nationalist militias, an example I purposely chose for its repugnance. But we should admit that our wish to fuck shit up is partly driven by the same urge to civilizational dismemberment as can be found in many interethnic conflicts, and in the minds of fighters more generally. As central power is weakened in some areas, possibilities for anarchy in both its happy and horrible meanings will open up. From food riots to insurrection. Climate wars to come may wipe out many anarchists, but is unlikely to kill off anarchism, which as a political movement has survived significant culls of its adherents in past local apocalypses. Either wiped out during periods of counter-revolutionary tumult, or picked off as the chosen prey of authoritarians during relative social peace, anarchists do have a tendency to get it in the neck. Our ranks have been further thinned by the many who have felt forced to escape civilization through either suicide or drugs. Despite all the horrors of the last 200 years, anarchism is, as the New York Times put it, the creed that won't stay dead. Joseph Kahn, Anarchism, the creed that won't stay dead. This is heartening, but we are not ideological machines. It does matter that anarchists themselves, i.e., you, me, our families and friends we have yet to meet, keep on living, not just the ideal. It matters to me. Give or take the particularities of the local, we may have 20 years, probably more, to prepare for these ruptures, not as an alternative to other tasks at hand, but as an integral part of a long-term, multi-pronged strategy. For some, it will also be a matter of life or death. While future climate wars will be an extension of the present conditions, they are likely to be far bigger and more extreme. In some places, peoples, anarchists among them, could transform climate wars into successful libertarian insurrection. In others, the battle may simply be for survival, or even death with dignity and meaning. Those in relatively stable social environments, politically and climatically, will probably be faced by an increasingly oppressive surveillance state and a mass which increasingly fears the barbarism beyond the walls. What actual practical stuff needs to be done will depend largely on where and who you are. While we may have some shared aspirations, climate change reinforces the basic truth that we do not have one shared global future. While everywhere the enemy is estrangement and domestication, the situations in Basingstoke and Bangladesh are different in the present, and will be in the future. The fundamental nature of all civilizations is an illusory estrangement from wilderness, deepening as we become estranged from each other, from the land, from the product of our labor, and even from our own desires. Wild animals, humans included, are tamed, domesticated, by being fenced off, separated from their natural environments, and free members of their own species. Dominance is burned into brains through violence and rationing of resource. Wilderness is tamed both without and within. The birth of domestication involved the initiation of production, vastly increased divisions of labor, and the completed foundations of social stratification. This amounted to an epochal mutation both in the character of human existence and its development, clouding the latter with even more violence and work. John Zerzan, Elements of Refusal. While it is important to try and understand their origins, it would be a mistake to see estrangement and domestication as past events. Rather, they are processes that can be, and is, resisted. For starters, see also Ian Hodder, The Domestication of Europe. Leopold Rock, Industrial Domestication, Industry as the Origins of Modern Domination. Derek Jensen, et al., Strangely Like War, The Global Assault on Forests. Jacques Camat, Against Domestication, and Beasts of Burden, Capitalism, Animals, Communism. During his lecture at the Royal Society, Lovelock stated, "We now face the stark choice between a return to a natural life as a small band of hunter-gatherers or a much reduced high-tech civilization." James Lovelock, Climate Change on the Living Earth. Rather than a choice, there is likely to be both sorts of survivor, as there is now, high-tech industrial citizen and low-tech gatherer-hunter anarchist. In between these two extremes will lie, buried or hungry, the much reduced, many from climate wars, along with those eking out a possibly freer, or not, life on the margins of agricultural/pastoral viability. Let's look then at what possibilities there may be for liberty and wilderness in some of these diverging life ways.